We are back, and we are joined now by Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics and adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. Giorgio, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Good to be with you.
So, Syria, can you give us a rundown of the recent events? I know opposition fighters seized Aleppo last week. What is the context of this recent flare-up?
Sure. First of all, it's really an honor to be a guest on your show. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you.
Back when the Arab Spring erupted in Syria in 2011, the country quickly spiraled into a gruesome civil war that involved many outside actors that had various interests in Syria. In 2015, Russia intensified its military intervention to support the government led by President Bashar al-Assad, which was also receiving a lot of support from Iran and various non-state actors backed by Iran, chiefly Lebanon's Hezbollah. And that sort of turned the tide in the Syrian civil war, again, this being in 2015. And the regime's forces took control not over all of Syria, but over a huge amount of the country, taking control of the major cities in Syria. And basically by 2020, the Syrian civil war essentially froze. And the northwestern part of Syria, Idlib, remained under the control of various opposition groups, many of them being Islamist and jihadist groups, some of them backed by Turkey. And they were really confined to Idlib. And then in the northeast of Syria, you've had a U.S. military presence, and it has been working mostly with a Kurdish group, the YPG, which is linked to the PKK group that the U.S. and Turkey and European Union consider a terrorist organization. Anyway, as I said, the conflict basically froze along those lines in 2020 as a consequence of a deal that Turkey and Russia negotiated. Now, last month, that the conflict unfroze, and we had these rebel forces led by HTS from Idlib taking over Aleppo. And very recently today, as I'm sure your viewers know, these rebels also took another important city in Syria, Hama. And that is where we're basically at right now. It was really significant, the extent to which the rebels took over Aleppo, the second biggest city in Syria, once known really as the economic capital of Syria. This is a city that the regime took back in 2016 following a gruesome, basically 1 year long effort. And right now there are so many open questions about what's going to happen next. It seems that the rebels have a lot of momentum, a lot of energy. The regime, with support from Russia's military, has not been able to push back against the rebel offensive. We'll have to see if the forces loyal to Assad are going to regroup or not. The situation is extremely fluid, to put it mildly.
And can you give us some backstory on Assad and he's obviously allied with Russia. He's used chemical weapons on his own population, but he's also a part of, I would say, the anti-U.S. empire axis within the region. So there's some complicated politics there. But if you could just give people a sense of how that fits into, U.S. Interests in the region and Assad's relationship with that.
Absolutely. Well, Bashar al-Assad, the current president of Syria, came to power in 2000. His father, Hafez al-Assad, was the president of Syria from 1970 up until 2000. During the Cold War, Syria was very much in the Soviet camp, not in the U.S. camp. And Syria has, been an enemy of the closest ally the U.S. has in the region, Israel, going back to the establishment of Israel in 1948. Syria has committed itself to resisting many aspects of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East for many, many decades. And I think an important point to bring up here is that Syria was one of very few Arab countries that embraced the Islamic Revolution in Iran in 1979. As I'm sure all your viewers are aware, that was a dramatic revolution that led to the establishment of a very anti-American regime in Iran, formerly the Islamic Republic of Iran, that has been working to challenge U.S. foreign policy interests in the Middle East and elsewhere in the world too. The Syrian government and the new Iranian government were very much bonded by a set of shared strategic interests, and there were some ideological synergies. And Syria and Iran have maintained a very close alliance ever since the Islamic Revolution of 1979 in Iran. And Syria has played a critical role in helping Iran project its influence throughout the Middle East. The most important non-state actor, which is allied with Iran, often called a proxy. I don't use that word myself. I think maybe better to say an ally or sort of a surrogate of Iran, is Hezbollah in Lebanon. I'm sure we'll talk about that group later on in this discussion. But it is through Syria that Iran has been able to arm and train Hezbollah. And the Syrian government has supported Hezbollah over the years. In 2006, when the Lebanese organization fought Israel to a standstill, the Syrian and Iranian governments were giving a lot of support to the organization. And then, of course, after the Syrian civil war began, Hezbollah played a very important role in terms of helping the Assad government maintain its power. The Lebanese group sent many of its fighters into Syria, who played a very critical role in some key battles that turned the balance in favor of the Syrian government. But the main superpower, the main global power that is the most important ally for Syria is Russia, which really sees the survival of Assad's government as extremely important, not only to Moscow's ability to assert itself as a powerful actor in the Middle East, but the relationship that Moscow has with Syria is important to Vladimir Putin's ability to project power on a global level as well.
And Syria in particular and Hezbollah, if you don't mind just fleshing this out, I mean, for people that may not have, I have a horrible geographic sense of place, so I need visual aid. So I'm going to just put this up there in case people need a reminder of Syria is a large country, and you see Iraq next to it. But Syria is right next to Israel, as is Jordan and Lebanon. And much of what Israel's aim has been in their ethnic cleansing and genocide of the Palestinians has been to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank, and you can see there that's eastward, into Jordan, into the desert, and that when I believe that under Trump, they're going to attempt to ethnically cleanse the entire West Bank and maybe annex it, push the 3+ million Palestinians in the West Bank into Jordan. That is their aim. But Syria being right there and being antagonistic to U.S. interests is quite relevant here. And of course, Lebanon and Syria being so close together and Hezbollah being that presence is important. So with that context for our audience, can you flesh out a little bit more Hezbollah's role in Syria, and how active they are in Syria, and how honestly the timing of this plays into the ceasefire that Israel immediately breached with Lebanon, but also, of course, the ongoing genocide in Gaza?
Yeah, great questions. So obviously the main state sponsoring Hezbollah is and always has been the Islamic Republic of Iran, and Hezbollah's ability to be so heavily armed has always depended on support from Tehran. So as the map you just put up can help everyone understand, for obvious geographic reasons, Syria has been so important to Iran's ability to keep sending weapons to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, bringing us to last year and this year with the hostilities that broke out between Hezbollah and Israel, one day after Hamas launched its incursion into southern Israel. So bringing us back to October 8th of 2023, Hezbollah, in solidarity with the Palestinians in Gaza, launched attacks against not Israel proper, but the Israeli military presence in a tiny part of southern Lebanon that Israel occupies. And that quickly escalated into intensifying hostilities between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Israel, which drastically intensified in September of this year. And Israel dealt very severe blows to Hezbollah, killing its Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, other high-ranking figures in the Lebanese organization. It took out much of the group's arsenal, and they also decimated important strategic points along the Lebanese-Syrian border that have been very important from the standpoint of Hezbollah's ability to receive these arms flows coming in from Syria and, by extension, Iraq and Iran. Point being, as a consequence of this warfare with Israel, Hezbollah is in a much weaker position. Add to that, Iran has a presence in Syria. There are many Iran-linked militias that have been on the ground in Syria, and they, along with Hezbollah, have played critical roles in terms of essentially shoring up the Syrian government and enabling Assad to maintain his control over the majority of land in Syria. But because of what Israel has done, not only in terms of its warfare against Hezbollah inside Lebanon, but also the Israelis have been relentlessly bombing Iran-linked targets in Syria. Iran and these Iran-linked surrogate groups are much weaker. And as a consequence of that, the Syrian government's hold on power has significantly weakened. And the anti-Assad rebels who were pushed into Idlib were able to take advantage of these dynamics. Add to the mix, Russia has also been on the ground in Syria, helping the fragile Syrian state maintain the control that it was able to hold for a number of years. But because of the conflict in Ukraine, the Russians have not been able to put the types of resources into Syria that they were prior to February 2022. And all of this is to say the Syrian state has been in a much weaker position, and the rebels seized the opportunity, taking advantage of Israel's warfare against Hezbollah and Iran-linked groups in Syria, as well as the conflict in Ukraine, to wage this offensive on Aleppo and other parts of Syria.
And why did, how, for broader context on this ongoing conflict, how did tensions in this internal civil war initially abate, basically? Back, I guess what was in 2013. I have a fuzzy memory of this. You can fill me in on the dates, but like what were the circumstances that led to the conflict kind of taking a breather, basically? And was that a big part of why the government is so fragile, because it was a really tenuous position since the last flare-up of extreme violence?
Yeah, great question. So again, going back to 2015, when Russia intensified its direct military intervention, that was a game-changing moment in the Syrian civil war. Had Moscow not gotten involved in the way it did, I don't know if the Syrian government would have survived. Perhaps rebel groups would have overthrown Assad's regime. But in any event, Russia, in coordination with Iran and Lebanon's Hezbollah, helped turn the tide of the civil war and really essentially solidify Assad's position, at least in Damascus and in other parts of the country. But, there are many, many serious problems in Syria. There are crippling economic sanctions that Western countries have put on Syria that have done a lot to choke the economy. The Syrian regime is also guilty of extremely high amounts of corruption, which have also caused very serious problems in the country. The state doesn't have control of Idlib. It doesn't have control of northeastern Syria. There are many non-Syrian groups from countries such as Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Lebanon that have been on the ground in Syria. And I think the morale of the Syrian Arab army was very low. Huge economic problems in the country. And I think all of these factors have to be considered when we're trying to understand why the state has become so weak. But again, there's also these regional and international variables, with Hezbollah being dealt some extremely severe blows by Israel in recent months, and then also Russia not having the bandwidth. What all of this says is that Assad's ability to maintain the grip that he had on much of Syria, at least until late last month, was due to the foreign support that he was receiving from regional and international allies.
And what is the relationship between the Kurdish rebels and say, Iran backed proxies, and how does Assad fit into that? Or I shouldn't say proxies, but Iran backed groups. How has Assad basically responded to those factors?
Yeah, so there is certainly a history of serious tension between the Assad government and the Kurdish minority in Syria. This goes back many, many decades. This is the Syrian Arab Republic. That's the formal name of the Syrian government. And the Kurdish minority has not always done very well under the rule of the Syrian Arab Republic. That being said, though, after the civil war erupted and we saw that within the opposition, many Islamist and jihadist groups were gaining the upper hand. And I want to be very clear here, not everyone in the opposition has been an Islamist or a jihadist, but the way things played out is that Islamist and jihadist groups became the most powerful fighting forces within the opposition. And many of the Kurds in Syria, for all the problems they had with the Assad government going back many, many years, they were extremely scared of the opposition. There is a tremendous amount of intolerance that certain elements in the opposition, particularly the Salafist jihadists, have had toward the Kurds of Syria. And many of the Kurdish communities were worried about what would happen if the Assad government would fall. So this has created some complicated dynamics between the dominant Syrian Kurdish fighting force in Syria, the YPG, which is backed by the United States, and the Syrian government. Where it stands right now, there is a U.S. military presence on the ground in northeastern Syria, roughly 900 troops. And the YPG is able to be the dominant group within the broader SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces. And there is a certain amount of autonomy that they have in northeastern Syria, again, a part of the country that the Damascus government doesn't control. At this point, with Trump returning to the White House, the YPG has to consider the real possibility of the U.S. withdrawing its military presence from Syria. And also, well, if that is going to happen, the YPG would be vulnerable not only to the ambitions of these different rebel groups, but also from Turkey, which has waged numerous military operations against the YPG over the years. And I think what we will see if the U.S. military is to exit Syria, the YPG is probably going to try to strike some grand deal with the Syrian government and sort of integrate the YPG into the Syrian government. Again, that's based on the premise, though, that the Syrian government is going to survive, and there are some question marks over that. So it's a very fluid situation, but I think the YPG does not necessarily have too many great options right now. But if Assad is going to maintain his power, and perhaps if Syrian regime forces launch a counteroffensive and they can take back some of the land they recently lost, I think probably the YPG is going to see integration into the Syrian state, not as an ideal course of action, but probably the least worst option for the YPG.
And I guess to wrap up here, just more broadly about the region, and I'm thinking about Lebanon a lot when you're talking about Syria, just like this very paper-thin governmental structure that's essentially non-functioning, and you have these groups that are seizing power in a region that has really been exploited by various great powers, but specifically the United States. They benefit from this lack of democracy in many ways because it allows for further exploitation. But these states that have been, carved up due to U.S. imperial interests, like what is the what is the future here? I think, for a functioning government in Syria and then by extension Lebanon, because obviously the prospects here are a bit grim.
Well, I certainly understand where the pessimism comes from. I think we need to realize that these conflict dynamics in the Middle East are extremely contagious. We've seen the war in Gaza that erupted in October 2023. It has spilled into many other parts of the Middle East. And as we've noted in this discussion, the violence taking place in Syria is in many important ways interconnected with the situation in Lebanon following the war between Hezbollah, the latest war between Hezbollah and Israel. And as long as these conflicts continue, I think they're going to continue spreading. These conflicts are not ones that any country, either in the region or outside the region, are able to control. It creates a tremendous amount of uncertainty. It's very unpredictable how events are going to unfold. I think even the most seasoned Syria experts were totally surprised by the lightning offensive that the rebels waged on Aleppo. So I would just point out that it's really difficult to predict what's going to happen next. But as this conflict in Syria is reigniting, now it's totally unfrozen, there's every reason to worry about it spilling into other countries, possibly into Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon. In some ways, it can have destabilizing effects on Turkey. It could have a destabilizing impact on Gulf countries as well. And until we get to the root causes of this violence, I think these conflicts, even if they freeze for a bit of time, they're always going to unfreeze. We saw that on October 7th, 2023. Many U.S. policymakers, many Israeli policymakers, and even many officials in Arab governments believed that the Palestinian issue was one that could be buried.
Yep.
But while you can bury issues, that is different from resolving them. And you can freeze conflicts, but frozen conflicts do tend to unfreeze at some point. And I think we're seeing all of that in play right now, and it's very, very unfortunate.
I said that was my last question, but really, you brought up the way that the United States felt the Palestinian issue was settled, right? The Abraham Accords, Trump and then Biden both pursuing normalization with Saudi Arabia without dealing with Palestinian self-determination or sovereignty or anything, basically ignoring the issue and saying the apartheid and the oppression can continue. How does that play into into relations with Syria and with Lebanon as well? And do you feel that strategy in particular played a role in this flare-up in the Syrian civil war?
Yeah, it's a good question. To be sure, the U.S. has always been in favor of Arab-Israeli normalization. And whenever there are signs that an Arab country is willing to normalize with Israel, that's something that policymakers in Washington are always excited about. And when Trump was president and he brought his administration brokered several diplomatic agreements that normalized ties between Israel and some Arab states, that was seen as a huge success. And Biden, as you noted, he tried to build on the Abraham Accords. He tried to expand the scope of these normalization deals to bring more Arab states into the Abraham Accords. But what I think many officials in Washington fail to appreciate is that right now, especially in the post-October 7th period, There is so much rage in the Arab world toward Israel. When you go to Arab countries, I mean, there is an absolute consensus that Israel is waging a genocide. In the West, there's a debate about whether or not this should be called a genocide or not. But all over the Arab world, everyone understands this to be a genocide. Yeah. And so the talk of normalizing relations between Arab countries and Israel in this current context is so toxic that Arab governments, even if they would find the idea of normalization to be beneficial, they can't touch it because they have to deal with their own population, their own citizens, and they have their own domestic politics to consider. So I think as long as Israel is continuing to wage its war on Gaza, we cannot expect the Abraham Accords to expand. That being said, I have no doubt that probably even between now and when Biden leaves in January, his administration will still continue efforts to bring more Arab countries, chiefly Saudi Arabia, into the Abraham Accords. I'm convinced it will fail. And I'm sure when Trump comes back in January, his administration is going to try to continue bringing more Arab states into the Abraham Accords. But again, there's certain dynamics in the region that make it so Arab states just simply cannot agree to normalize with Israel. And even, I'll end by saying, even if there's a ceasefire in Gaza tomorrow, the legacy of what Israel has been doing in Gaza for the past 14 months will make it so that probably for many years, Arab states that are not currently in the Abraham Accords are not going to formally join. Of course, anything can happen. It's tough to make bold predictions, but I'm pretty confident in saying this.
We did have one viewer question, and this is truly what I will end on here. Lee from Ohio writes in, question for the interview: is Russia likely to abandon ties to Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis?
Great question. I do not see Russia walking away from its partnership with Iran. The partnership that Moscow and Tehran have is at its strongest point now. And this has a lot to do with many factors, but a very important one has to do with the fact that Iran has played an important role in helping Russia wage its war on Ukraine. The Russians have become very dependent on Iranian drones. And at the same time, as the US-Israeli alliance remains hostile toward Iran, Iran has no choice but to work with Russia. And therefore, it's very difficult for me to imagine these two states moving away from the partnership that they've spent years developing. That is not to say that there are no conflicts of interest between Iran and Russia. And one place where we actually do see some of those conflicts of interest are in Syria. And this brings us to the role of groups such as Hezbollah and other non-state actors that are backed by Iran on the ground. We need to keep in mind that Russia is Syria's ultimate security guarantor. And when Israel bombs these Iran-linked groups inside Syria, that happens because Russia permits it to happen. Russia has not had, at least up until now, Russia has not had a problem with Israel doing that. And that is something which has caused officials in the Iranian government to be a bit bitter, or I should say quite bitter toward the Russians. So there's no love between the Iranian and Russian governments, but they're both, the leadership in both countries, very pragmatic. And they see that in the big picture, within the context of challenging US hegemony, they both see the partnership between Tehran and Moscow as very, very important to their national interests. Again, I repeat, I don't see either Russia or Iran wanting to walk away from their bilateral partnership.
Well, really appreciate your time today, Giorgio Cafiero, CEO of Gulf State Analytics, and also an adjunct assistant professor at Georgetown University. Really appreciate your time today. Thanks so much.
The pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.